There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not arrive with noise. It arrives quietly, not as abandonment, but as distance. Not because love disappeared, but because language slowly stopped matching. One day, familiar conversations begin to feel thinner. The jokes land softly, then not at all. The rooms once filled with comfort now echo with something unnamed. Growth does this without asking permission. It rearranges inner furniture while the outer world remains the same. Outgrowing people rarely feels like victory. It feels like grief without a funeral, a private mourning for versions of connection that can no longer exist. This is the quiet pain no one prepares you for, the ache of becoming someone new while still standing among those who knew the old self by heart. It rarely announces itself. There is no argument, no dramatic ending, no moment where doors are slammed or words are taken back. Distance appears quietly, like a pause in conversation that stretches just a little too long. At first, it is easy to ignore. A feeling that arrives briefly, then leaves. A sense that something is slightly misaligned, but still familiar enough to be comfortable. The same people, the same places, the same routines. Everything looks unchanged on the surface. And yet, something inside has shifted its weight. Conversations begin to feel repetitive, as if they are looping instead of moving forward. Stories are told again, with the same emphasis, the same punchlines. Laughter still happens, but it feels thinner, delayed, like an echo of something that once came naturally. Listening becomes more effortful, not because care is gone, but because presence no longer feels complete. This is often the first sign, not boredom, not judgment, but a quiet sense of emotional desynchronization. There is still affection, still shared history, still an understanding built over years. But something essential has moved ahead without dragging everyone else along. Growth rarely travels in groups. It tends to move one person at a time, slowly, internally, unnoticed by others until the distance has already formed. In these moments, there is confusion. The mind searches for explanations. Maybe it is just a phase. Maybe stress is creating distance where none exists. Maybe closeness will return if enough effort is applied. After all, these are people who mattered. People who witnessed earlier versions of the self. People who remember who someone was before the changes began. And so, attempts are made to bridge the gap. Extra energy is poured into conversations. Old jokes are revived. Familiar roles are stepped back into. The version of the self that once fit seamlessly is temporarily brought forward, like an old coat pulled from the closet. It still fits, technically, but it feels heavier now, less breathable, less true. There is a subtle exhaustion that comes with this effort, a tiredness that has nothing to do with time or work. It is the fatigue of emotional translation, of constantly editing thoughts to keep them relatable, of shrinking curiosity to avoid discomfort, of choosing familiarity over honesty. This is where the pain quietly begins, not because others have done anything wrong, not because growth is inherently lonely, but because awareness has arrived before acceptance. Being in a room full of familiar faces can suddenly feel isolating, not due to rejection but because the inner landscape has expanded while the outer environment remains unchanged. There is a strange guilt that follows, a sense of betrayal, as if changing internally is a silent offense against shared history. After all, these people were there before the growth. They supported earlier versions. They offered comfort when it was needed most. How can distance exist without dishonor? And yet, it does. Distance does not always mean absence of love. Sometimes it simply means the emotional vocabulary has evolved. The topics that once felt sufficient now feel shallow. The perspectives that once felt safe now feel limiting. The silence between words becomes more noticeable than the words themselves. Often, this realization is accompanied by sadness rather than relief. There is grief for the ease that once existed, for the effortlessness of being understood without explanation, for the comfort of belonging without needing to explain why certain things now matter. This is not the grief of losing people. It is the grief of losing alignment. There is also fear. Fear of becoming fear of being perceived as distant, arrogant, or change too much. Fear that growth will eventually lead to complete separation. And beneath that, a quieter fear that continuing to grow may mean standing alone for a while. At this stage, nothing has ended. Relationships still exist. Messages are still exchanged. Meetings still happen. But something essential has shifted from the inside out. The emotional center of gravity has moved. This is the moment when outgrowing begins to make itself known. Not loudly, not clearly, but unmistakably. It is the moment when presence no longer feels mutual, when connection feels remembered rather than lived, when the heart recognizes a distance the mind is not yet ready to name. And so, The quiet pain settles in, unannounced, unresolved, waiting to be understood. Growth rarely begins where others can see it. It does not announce itself with confidence or clarity. It starts quietly, often in response to something that could not be ignored. Sometimes it begins with pain, not the dramatic kind, but the slow, accumulating weight of emotional discomfort. Moments that linger longer than they should, questions that repeat themselves late at night, a growing awareness that certain patterns no longer feel sustainable. Growth, in this sense, is not ambition. It is adaptation. Other times it begins with curiosity, an unexpected pull toward understanding, a desire to name feelings that once went unexamined. Exposure to new ideas, perspectives, or inner language can quietly rearrange the way meaning is made. Once this happens, returning to old frameworks becomes difficult, not because they are wrong, but because they are incomplete. Growth often starts as a private process. No one else is present when old assumptions loosen their grip. No one witnesses the internal negotiations, the doubts, the moments of emotional honesty that feel almost dangerous at first. From the outside, nothing appears different. The same voice, the same habits, the same social presence. But inside, something has begun to reorganize. This is why growth rarely feels synchronized. People grow in response to different stimuli. One person heals after being hurt. Another grows after being understood for the first time. One begins questioning inherited beliefs. Another finds safety in keeping them. These timelines are not coordinated. They unfold according to inner necessity, not shared agreement. Shared history can create the illusion of shared direction. Years of connection can make it feel as though everyone is moving together. But history is not movement. It is memory. Growth, on the other hand, is forward-facing. It responds to the present moment and anticipates the future. When one person begins this process earlier or more intensely, divergence becomes inevitable. Often, growth is born from emotional responsibility. The decision, sometimes unconscious, to stop avoiding certain feelings, to look more closely at fear instead of masking it, to examine anger rather than projecting it outward. This kind of inner work changes the way reality is perceived. Emotional reactions become information instead of identity. Patterns become visible instead of automatic. As this happens, certain conversations lose their grip. Complaints that once felt bonding now feel draining. Repetitive cycles of validation begin to feel hollow. There is a quiet shift toward depth, toward meaning, toward understanding rather than distraction. This does not make someone superior. It makes them different. And difference is often misunderstood. From the outside, growth can look like withdrawal, like judgment, like disinterest. But internally, it often feels like responsibility, a commitment to not abandoning the inner changes once they have begun. There is a sensitivity that develops, a heightened awareness of emotional environments. Certain spaces that once felt neutral now feel loud. Certain dynamics feel heavy instead of comforting. There is also loss here. Growth requires letting go of identities that once provided belonging. Roles that made sense within a certain group may no longer fit. The listener, the fixer, the entertainer, the one who stays quiet to keep peace. As these roles dissolve, relationships built around them begin to shift as well. This is where the ache deepens. Not because growth is wrong, but because it costs something real. That there is often a moment of internal resistance. A wish to pause growth, to stay where connection feels easy, to choose comfort over expansion. But growth does not respond to negotiation. Once awareness arrives, it cannot be unseen. Once certain truths are felt, they cannot be unfelt. This is why outgrowing feels passive, even though it is deeply active. No one chooses to drift apart deliberately. It happens as a consequence of choosing to stay present with inner change. The alternative would require ignoring what has already begun to take shape. And so, growth continues quietly, internally, independently, while others remain where they are. Not wrong, not stagnant, just aligned with a different rhythm. The distance that appears is not created by rejection, but by timing, by inner evolution occurring at different speeds. This is the origin of outgrowing, not in ego, not in superiority, but in the simple human reality that inner landscapes do not evolve simultaneously, and once growth begins, it carries its own gravity, pulling gently, steadily, toward a self that can no longer fully return to where it started. Outgrowing others is often interpreted as a social phenomenon, but beneath it lies a psychological one. Human identity is not fixed. It is constructed, revised, and reshaped across time through experience, reflection, and emotional learning. The mind is constantly updating its internal model of the world. What feels safe, what feels meaningful, what feels aligned. When these updates occur unevenly between people, divergence is not a failure of connection. It is a natural outcome of development. Psychology describes this process as differentiation, the ability to hold a clear sense of self while remaining emotionally connected to others. In early life, belonging often takes priority over authenticity. The nervous system learns that safety comes from fitting in, from mirroring, from shared understanding. Over time, however, emotional maturity introduces a new requirement: coherence, the need for inner experiences, values, and behaviors to align. When coherence becomes more important than belonging, relationships inevitably change. Neuroscience supports this shift. As the brain develops through adulthood, the prefrontal cortex responsible for reflection, emotional regulation, and long-term thinking continues refining how meaning is assigned. Emotional reactions that once felt overwhelming become observable. Impulses soften. Curiosity replaces defensiveness. This neurological maturation alters not just behavior, but perception. What once felt exciting may now feel chaotic. What once felt normal may now feel draining. What once felt harmless may now feel misaligned. At the same time, attachment systems evolve. Early bonds are often maintained through proximity, routine, and shared emotional language. As individuals mature, attachment becomes more nuanced. Connection is sustained not just by closeness, but by mutual understanding, respect for boundaries, and emotional reciprocity. When these elements are no longer balanced, discomfort arises. This is not because anyone has failed. It is because the psychological requirements for connection have changed. Cognitive schemas, the mental frameworks used to interpret experience, also shift. Someone who has examined their inner world may begin to notice patterns others are not yet aware of. Emotional avoidance, repetition of unresolved narratives, the reliance on external validation. These observations are not judgments, but they create internal distance. It becomes harder to participate unconsciously in dynamics that are now clearly seen. This awareness creates a paradox. The more emotionally literate someone becomes, the less they can pretend not to notice emotional undercurrent. Silence carries meaning. Humor carries avoidance. Conflict avoidance carries fear. Once these layers become visible, interaction changes. Presence becomes heavier. Engagement requires discernment. Psychology calls this increased emotional granularity, the ability to differentiate and name subtle emotional states. While this skill deepens self-understanding, it can widen interpersonal gaps. Conversations that remain on the surface begin to feel incomplete. Emotional exchanges that avoid depth begin to feel unsatisfying. This does not mean depth is always superior. It means the nervous system has adapted to require it. Another factor lies in value realignment. Values are not static. They evolve as experiences reshape priorities. What once mattered status, approval, sameness may give way to autonomy, authenticity, or emotional safety. When values diverge, relationships experience strain not through conflict, but through misalignment. People can care deeply for one another while no longer wanting the same things from connection. Psychological growth also increases tolerance for solitude. As self-regulation improves, the need for constant external reassurance decreases. This can be misinterpreted as emotional distance, but it often reflects internal stability. However, this shift can disrupt relational balance if others rely more heavily on constant emotional exchange. In this way, divergence is not about moving away from others. It is about moving toward inner congruence. The pain arises when relational systems are built on older versions of the self. When growth occurs, those systems struggle to recalibrate. There may be subtle tension, misunderstandings, or a sense of being unseen, not because others refuse to see, but because they are relating to a self that no longer fully exists. Psychologically, this creates grief, the loss of a shared emotional reality, a recognition that mutual understanding once sustained by similarity now requires translation. And translation is exhausting. This is why outgrowing feels lonely even when surrounded by people. The mind has moved into a different interpretive space. Emotional signals are processed differently. Meaning is constructed through a new lens. Divergence, then, is not abandonment. It is evolution occurring at different depths, at different speeds. Understanding this does not remove the pain, but it reframes it. Outgrowing is not a rejection of connection. It is a consequence of the mind learning how to be more fully itself. There is a quiet tension that forms when growth continues but attachment remains. A tension that does not show itself in words but in hesitation. On one side there is loyalty, to shared history, to people who were present before the transformation, to the versions of connection that once offered safety and belonging. On the other side, there is becoming, the internal momentum toward coherence, the refusal often unconscious to return to ways of being that no longer feel honest. This tension does not feel dramatic, it feels heavy, like carrying something fragile while trying not to drop anything else. Loyalty is not just an emotional bond, it is a psychological contract, an agreement formed through time, experience, and mutual recognition. It says, "You knew me then, and that knowing still matters now." Breaking this contract, even unintentionally, can trigger guilt, a sense of betrayal without a clear offense. This guilt often leads to resistance. Resistance to growth, resistance to change, resistance to acknowledging what is already true. There is an internal bargaining that takes place. Perhaps the changes can be softened. Perhaps certain parts of the self can remain dormant in familiar spaces. Perhaps emotional honesty can be delayed to preserve harmony. These compromises are rarely conscious. They emerge as subtle pauses before speaking, thoughts left unshared, feelings downplayed to maintain equilibrium. Over time, this self-silencing creates strain. The nervous system begins to register a gap between inner reality and outer expression. While loyalty seeks continuity, the psyche seeks alignment. This is where discomfort deepens, not because others demand conformity, but because the self can no longer fully inhabit older relational roles. There is also fear here, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being labeled distant, cold, or change too much, fear that growth will be interpreted as rejection rather than necessity. These fears are not unfounded. Social systems often rely on predictability. When someone changes, it disrupts relational stability. Others may feel left behind, even if no one intended to move ahead. The emotional response to this disruption can manifest as subtle defensiveness, confusion, or withdrawal. This reinforces the inner conflict. Loyalty whispers that staying the same is kinder. Becoming insists that shrinking is not sustainable, that the mind attempts to hold both. To be authentic without causing rupture, to grow without creating distance. But this balance is fragile. Over time, something must give. Either growth is paused or loyalty is redefined. This is where grief begins to surface more clearly. Grief for the ease of connection that once required no explanation. Grief for being understood without translation. Grief for the shared emotional language that no longer flows naturally. At the same time, there is frustration, a quiet resentment that can arise when emotional labor becomes one-sided, when understanding flows outward but not inward, when curiosity about change is absent. This resentment often goes unspoken, buried beneath empathy and patience, but it accumulates psychologically. This conflict is known as role strain, the stress that arises when internal expectations no longer match external roles. Someone who has evolved emotionally may feel constrained by expectations rooted in their past. Continuing to meet these expectations requires effort that gradually depletes emotional energy. The result is withdrawal, not as punishment, not as avoidance, but as preservation. Distance becomes a form of self-protection. Silence becomes a boundary. Less presence becomes a way to remain whole. This withdrawal often carries shame, a belief that needing space is a failure of character rather than a signal of transition. But the psyche does not create distance without reason. It responds to imbalance, to misalignment, to the need for integration. Loyalty and becoming are not opposites, but they often feel that way during transition. True loyalty does not require self-abandonment, and true becoming does not require erasure of the past. The difficulty lies in the in-between space, where neither has been fully redefined. This is the most emotionally complex stage of outgrowing, where love remains, but alignment fades, where care persists, but presence feels incomplete. Nothing has ended yet, but something is asking to change, and resisting that change only prolongs the quiet pain. There comes a moment when resistance grows tired, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that settles deep in the body before it reaches the mind. That it is the moment when pretending begins to feel heavier than truth, when the effort to stay aligned with old dynamics costs more than the discomfort of acknowledging change. This is not a decision made in one clear thought. It arrives as a series of realizations that slowly arrange themselves into clarity. The moment of knowing often appears in ordinary scenes. A conversation that once felt familiar now feels distant beyond repair. A silence that no longer invites comfort. a realization that returning to an earlier version of connection would require erasing parts of the self that have already taken root. There is no anger in this moment. Mostly, there is sadness, and beneath it, relief. This is the point where growth becomes undeniable, not because others are wrong, not because connection has failed, but because the inner self has crossed a threshold. Psychologically, this moment represents acceptance, the cessation of internal bargaining. The mind stops asking whether things can go back to how they were. It stops searching for ways to reverse what has already unfolded. Instead, it turns toward what is present, even if what is present is painful. There is grief here, but it is different from earlier grief. Less frantic, more grounded, it carries the weight of reality rather than resistance. This grief does not demand repair, it asks only to be acknowledged. Often, there is also guilt that surfaces sharply at this stage. Guilt for changing, guilt for not missing people in the same way, guilt for feeling more at ease alone than in familiar company. This guilt can feel disorienting, as though emotional responses themselves are being questioned. But emotional responses are not moral judgments. They are information. The moment of knowing involves recognizing this distinction, understanding that emotional distance is not cruelty, that outgrowing is not abandonment, that staying connected to oneself is not an act of disloyalty. There is also a subtle reclaiming of autonomy, a permission to stop justifying change, to stop softening truth to protect others from discomfort. This does not mean confrontation or detachment. It means internal alignment, a quiet inner agreement to no longer argue with what is. At this stage, something important shifts. The narrative moves from loss to transition, from something is wrong to something is changing. This reframing does not erase pain, but it gives it shape. Meaning begins to form around the experience rather than collapsing beneath it. The nervous system responds to this acceptance. Tension eases. The constant vigilance required to maintain outdated dynamics relaxes. Emotional energy once spent on self-editing becomes available again. There is more space internally, even if externally things feel uncertain. This is also the moment when solitude becomes less threatening. Not because loneliness disappears, but because being alone no longer feels like failure. It feels like honesty, a temporary state that reflects reality rather than avoidance. There may still be contact, messages, occasional meetings, but something has fundamentally shifted. Expectations loosen, emotional dependency softens, the pressure to perform closeness fades. What remains is choice rather than obligation. This is where compassion deepens. Compassion for others who are not obligated to grow at the same pace. Compassion for the self who did not choose change but responded to it. Compassion for the relationship itself, which served its purpose when it could. The moment of knowing does not offer certainty about what comes next. It does not provide a clear map. It simply closes one internal debate. It affirms that becoming smaller to preserve comfort is no longer an option. This is not an ending. It is a recognition that growth has already happened, that distance has already formed, that the task now is not to undo, but to understand. And in this understanding, something settles. The quiet pain remains, but it no longer feels chaotic, it feels real. And reality, once accepted, becomes lighter to carry. After the moment of knowing, something gentler begins to emerge. Not resolution, not closure, but integration. This is the stage where the psyche learns to hold complexity without urgency, to carry love and distance at the same time, to allow affection to exist without forcing proximity. It is here that the experience of outgrowing shifts from rupture to understanding. Carrying both does not mean maintaining the same level of connection. It means redefining what connection is allowed to become. There is a quiet reframing that takes place. Relationships are no longer evaluated by how close they feel, but by how honestly they can be held. Some connections soften into something lighter, occasional check-ins, shared memories, mutual respect without emotional reliance. Others may drift further, not as loss, but as natural release. This redefinition requires letting go of binary thinking. Connection does not have to mean constant presence. Distance does not have to mean rejection. Love does not have to demand access. Psychologically, this reflects emotional maturity, the capacity to tolerate ambiguity, to resist the urge to categorize relationships as successes or failures, to accept that meaning can exist without permanence. This stage also involves grieving what will no longer be sought, the deep conversations that cannot happen here, the understanding that will not be found in familiar places. This grief is quieter than before, less sharp. It surfaces in moments of nostalgia rather than longing. Importantly, There is no need to assign blame. Outgrowing does not require someone to be at fault. It simply requires recognition of difference, different needs, different rhythms, different emotional capacities. Accepting this allows resentment to dissolve before it hardens. There is also an internal softening toward the self. The pressure to justify distance fades. Boundaries no longer feel defensive. They feel descriptive. They explain what is possible without demanding that anyone change. With this comes a new kind of respect for others' paths, an understanding that growth is not linear or universal, that people arrive at awareness through their own timing, if at all. This removes the urge to pull others forward or wait indefinitely for alignment to return. Carrying both also means honoring the past without living inside it, allowing gratitude to exist without obligation. Memories can be held as evidence of what was real, not as promises of what must continue. This is where peace begins to replace tension, not because everything makes sense, but because nothing is being forced. Emotionally, there is more space, fewer internal negotiations, less self-monitoring. The energy once spent managing misalignment becomes available for presence elsewhere within the self, within new environments, within quieter moments. There is also a subtle strengthening of inner trust, a belief that connection will find its appropriate form when the self is allowed to remain whole. This trust does not guarantee new relationships. It simply removes the fear that solitude is a permanent verdict. Learning to carry both does not erase the quiet pain entirely, but it transforms it. The pain becomes softer, less personal. It is understood as a transitional feeling rather than a defining one. This stage does not demand optimism. It does not promise replacements. It simply offers SPAC-IOSNTSS. In that space, something important happens. The self no longer feels divided. Growth and care are no longer in conflict. The need to choose between loyalty and becoming dissolves. Both are allowed, in different forms, in different measures. And this allowance is where healing quietly takes root, not as a dramatic shift, but as a steady easing, a sense that nothing essential has been lost, even if much has changed. Outgrowing no longer feels like standing between worlds. It feels like standing firmly where one is, without pulling the past forward or pushing it away. There is a quiet dignity in standing alone without feeling abandoned, not alone in the sense of being disconnected, but alone in the sense of being fully present with where one is. This is often where outgrowing finally settles, not as loss, but as orientation, a recognition of self that does not require constant reflection through others. At this stage, the silence feels different, less heavy, more spacious. It carries the absence of noise rather than the absence of meaning. There is room here for thought, for slowness, for a kind of listening that was not possible before. Outgrowing others does not lead to emptiness. It leads to openness. The openness is subtle at first, a willingness to let new forms of connection appear without searching for them, a soft curiosity rather than expectation. The understanding that alignment is not something to chase, but something that emerges when inner clarity is allowed to exist undisturbed. There is also a shift in perception. Past relationships are no longer viewed through the lens of deficiency. They are seen as accurate reflections of who one was at the time. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was false. Connection happened where it could, when it could. This perspective brings gratitude without attachment. The people who are outgrown are not left behind emotionally. They are carried differently, as influences, as chapters, as echoes that helped shape the inner voice that now feels more distinct. Their presence remains, but without the weight of expectation. There is a quiet compassion that develops here. Compassion for those still moving through phases already past. Compassion for the self, who once needed what is no longer needed. Compassion for the inevitability of change. This compassion is not condescending. It is grounded. It understands that becoming is not linear and not uniform. That everyone is, in some way, still becoming, just not always in the same direction. Always in the same direction. At this stage, belonging is redefined. Belonging no longer means fitting into familiar spaces. It means fitting within oneself. The nervous system learns that safety can exist internally, not just This does not diminish the value of connection. It deepens it. Relationships are no longer used to stabilize identity. They are allowed to meet it. There is also patience here. Patience with solitude. Patience with uncertainty. Patience with the slow unfolding of what comes next. Outgrowing does not rush to fill the space it creates. It trusts the pause. It understands that growth often requires intervals of quiet, where nothing new is added so that what has already changed can settle. In this quiet, something essential becomes clear. Outgrowing everyone does not mean outgrowing connection. It means outgrowing missile, IGNMENT. It means releasing the need to be understood by everyone. It means allowing understanding to arrive where resonance exists. And when it does, it feels different, less effortful, more mutual, more alive. These connections may come later, or they may already exist, quietly, unnoticed. Either way, they are not replacements. They are continuations, expressions of a self that no longer needs to contract to be held. The quiet pain that once defined this experience does not disappear entirely, but it changes its tone. It becomes something like tenderness, a sensitivity to change, a respect for the complexity of human bonds. And perhaps that is the final understanding, that outgrowing is not an act of separation, but of fidelity. Fidelity to inner truth, fidelity to emotional coherence, fidelity to the process of becoming who one already is. Those who are outgrown remain part of the story. Those yet to arrive will meet a truer version. And in between, there is this moment, quiet, whole, still becoming.